Oh, I believe in a new world. I do, yes, I do. And every so often, if I'm being completely honest, and with apologies to Al Carmines, I have my doubts. So I'm grateful to be in a space today where it is our invitation and duty to creatively resurrect new worlds in the constant wake of continuing crucifixions in this old world. And I want to invite us into a little visioning story exercise today before we listen to some visioning story songs from Judson Arts Wednesdays. I love to tell some stories. I hate to tell some other stories. What are the stories you tell? What are the stories you tell others about yourself? What are the stories you tell yourself about yourself? What are the stories you avoid hearing? What are the stories you actively seek out? What are the stories you keep close to your chest and far from your news feed and pray no one unearths until long after you are gone? It's probably not news to any of you that lately we've got false stories moving around us at a far faster rate than ever before. Last month, a study in the journal Science reported that on social media, false information is currently spreading 6 times as quickly as truth. And it's not always rogue science fiction-y bots spreading these falsehoods. It's often us, flesh and blood and bones, simple human beings spreading the destructive lies and fabulistic fabrications. This report suggests that normal, ordinary, everyday people are probably sharing this false news with such fervor because false news is more novel, more surprising, more interesting than the real stories. And you'll notice that I'm using the term false news, since the term fake news has been branded to spread entirely different and far more insidious mistrust than I'm actually describing here. Fake news is a term invented to dismiss reports that our current empire doesn't want you to believe. False news, for me, is a term for those stories that get shared because they shock in just the right way. They thrill, they titillate, they electrify, they even comfort. Then there's the false news we spread online about ourselves. A 2016 study concluded that among 2,000 interviewees, over 75% admitted to fabricating their social media content, making their lives look richer and fuller and less boring than they actually are. I'm sure that's none of you. Only 18% of respondents said that their Twitter and Facebook profiles accurately represent them and their real lives. 18%. We are spreading false news about the actual news, and we are spreading false news about our own selves. We are able to share stories with more efficiency than ever before, and this efficiency is efficiently blurring the ethical boundaries of storytelling. Now, I've loved stories for as long as I can remember. I've preached countless sermons here that basically have the same thesis. Tell your story, be the artist of your own narrative. And our Judson Arts Wednesdays programs are platforms for storytelling. Our Pop Lab conversation series was created so we would have more opportunities to tell one another more stories. I stand by storytelling as one of the greatest tools humans have ever discovered. I stand by that Joan Didion quotation. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. I stand by that trite, anonymous self-help sentiment. The shortest distance between two people is a story. We are meaning-seeking creatures. We look everywhere. We want to make sense of a teenager's suicide. We want to connect the sequential dots of a horrific tragedy. We want to create narrative from a despot's rise to power. But as I've witnessed false news, false stories, false histories spreading with more and more fire, and as I've witnessed other stories being left unheard, unabsorbed, uncelebrated, or even blatantly silenced, I've concluded that just as those beautiful sentiments about stories are true, the exact opposite is also true. Sadly, we also tell ourselves stories in order to kill, literally and figuratively. We tell ourselves stories in order to silence. We tell ourselves stories in order to hide from reality. We tell ourselves overarching meta-narratives in order to ignore the particular stories of others. The shortest distance between two people can be a story. But a story can also widen the gap between two people, 200 people, 2,000, 2 million. Even as we celebrate Earth Day, we collectively tell ourselves false stories in order to keep desecrating the natural world around us. We tell ourselves stories in order to explain away any possibility of change. Stories are tools, and stories are weapons. Stories can resurrect, and stories can crucify. Today's ancient testimony is a crucifixion story. This is the story of the assassination of the first Christian martyr. How many know Stephen? Yeah? All right. We're going to get to know him a little bit. He's thought of as the first Christian martyr, Christianity's loquacious proto-saint, the disciple who tells a whopper of a story right before he is stoned on the spot. And the backstory here is that Stephen is a model storyteller, picking up the mantle that Jesus has left behind, spreading the gospel to his fellow Hellenistic Jews, and trying to make miracles in the way any good disciple does. And he is called to explain himself before the Sanhedrin, which is basically the main jury of religious leaders. And instead of cowering or backing down or backtracking, Stephen stands firm in front of that council and tells a story, a long story. It takes up the entire 7th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. It's 50-some verses. He starts at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And he draws a narrative legacy line all the way from the origins of the Jewish people through all of the Hebrew stories of their failures and successes, and ends up right where he wants to, showing the Jesus followers, because they're not called Christians yet, showing the Jesus followers as the next natural phase in the evolution of Judaism. And as you can imagine, it's complicated. Immediately following Stephen's long-winded speech, we get this moment you heard Mia read. Stephen is found guilty of heresy and executed. The Sanhedrin decides to kill Stephen's story at the root before it spreads any further. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because Stephen's story doesn't die there. We wouldn't be here otherwise. It actually stems off into multiple directions, both very good and very, very bad. You'll notice that toward the end of the passage, one of the witnesses to Stephen's murder is a young man named Saul. You know who that is? In case you haven't figured it out already, I know Keen has. This is the very Saul who will soon have a conversion experience on the road to Damascus and change his name to Paul and become the most famous spreader of the Christian story in history. You might also notice that the words Stephen bellows as he dies are very, very similar to those words spoken by the world's most famous crucified man, Jesus. This storyteller, either Stephen or the storyteller who created this Acts of the Apostles narrative, wants to lay a deep foundation for the story of Christianity. If you are paying close attention, you might also know that Stephen's speech connecting the history of the Jewish people to the Christian story has often been used throughout world history to justify anti-Semitism and genocide. One person's beautiful story of lineage, if not carefully heard and continually re-examined, can be manipulated into a story designed to kill. Stories can resurrect, and stories can crucify. The distance between the two isn't always as wide as we'd like to believe. Finding the balance between embodying your own story and allowing the stories of others to change you is tricky. Now, in a moment, we're going to hear several story songs from the Oresteia Project, which is the current musical that several Judson Arts Wednesdays artists are creating every fourth Wednesday in this very room. If you haven't been yet, you've got to join us. We're going to meet again this Wednesday. And if you don't know the Oresteia, how many know the Oresteia? All right, about as many as know the story of Stephen. Great. Okay. The Oresteia is an ancient Greek cycle of tragic plays in which a family lives out the curses thrust upon them by decisions made over the course of their familial line. Here's really all you need to know about the plot, I promise. Everybody thinks their story is the accurate story. Everybody thinks they need revenge in order to fix their story. And no one wants to listen to anyone else's story. Got it? It's everything you want in a drama and nothing that you want in real life. I hope we all want to uncover what ancient stories might have to tell us about how we might reshape our own stories, how we might listen for stories we've been tuning out, how we might integrate stories so that all voices can be a bit closer to harmony. And I hope that's why we're all here. So last week, you heard me talk about the relaunch of the Poor People's Campaign. And as we enter that campaign, it's a perfect time for us at Judson to explore our own stories. The Poor People's Campaign is asking us to see both the intersections of oppressive systems and the particularities and individual stories at the heart of these intersections. The campaign wants us to connect systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted morality, while paying close attention to the particularities of each. Now, this can seem easy, but it's going to be very hard. This invitation cannot be accepted unless we pledge to be honest about our own historical missteps, honest about our own unintentional shortcomings and intentional myopia. We've got a wonderful track record here at Judson. And our stories could still use some re-examination and resurrection. The Poor People's Campaign, in addition to being a serious call for reclaiming morality in this country, is also, I believe, theater. Something we Judson drama queens do very, very well. It's an opportunity for communal catharsis on an epic stage. Stories are not just things we tell in order to underline our own cases. Stories can be catalysts. In ancient times, Greek drama was not simply storytelling as entertainment or propaganda. It was storytelling as communal change agent. The stories were designed to hold an uncompromising mirror up to human failure, human greed, human disregard for difference, diversity, and nature, and to invite audiences to question their own assumptions by recognizing themselves in the characters. It was an invitation to seek individual and communal change by seeing the tragedy that befalls those who avoid new stories. Ancient Greek drama loved to tell the story not because it let them celebrate themselves and move on, but because telling the story made them look in the mirror, rethink their assumptions, and try to transform. Now, sometimes I fear that our scriptures, our ancient stories, can seem so far away and so abstract that we don't see how our own stories can be just as epic, just as beautiful, and just as dangerous. But as you listen to these characters sing, I invite you to reconsider those questions we started with today. What's the stories you love to tell? What's the stories you hate to tell? And test the spirit of your own stories. The characters in the Oresteia are dealing with the same themes at the center of the Poor People's Campaign. Systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, distorted morality, and they're playing it out on a big epic stage and a tiny, tiny individual family stage. Sadly, the ancient is the contemporary. But we have one thing now that these ancient characters no longer have. We have the current opportunity to tell, listen, and change stories. Decades ago, St. James Baldwin commented on the false stories this country has hidden behind for centuries. And he said, "Go back to where you started, as far back as you can. Examine all of it. Travel your road again and tell the truth about it." Every time we revisit our stories, we have the opportunity to tell the truth about them. That's what we're doing here every Sunday. We're looking at our beloved stories and testing whether they crucify or resurrect. Do your stories resurrect without crucifying yourself and without crucifying anybody else? If they don't, if we just uncover a bunch of false news, it's time to gather around the fire again. It's time to together create the truthful, good news that will bring us back to life. And I know I've been promising music for like 15 minutes now. So I want the company of the Oresteia Project to come on up here. You've got, there they are. You've got particular characters in front of you. You've got particular lyrics in front of you. But see where the universal lies in the particular and watch them try to figure it out.